There is a room in Paris that most people never see. No velvet ropes, no polished floors, just rows of industrial shelves, metal cabinets, and glass containers. The air is cold with the sterile scent of preserving alcohol and old paper. It is the smell of preservation. Nothing here is permitted to move. Each jar is sealed against decay. Drawers slide out on oiled runners just far enough to reveal their contents, then click shut, containing what they hold. The careful labels, written in shifting hands over nearly 2 centuries, have been translated and recatalogued, and a rigid order is maintained. For 187 years, this storage had been the final, fixed stop for Saartjie Baartman. She is present here not as a person, but as a collection, the remnants of a notable life and subsequent display. Her skeleton lies on a separate shelf, bones cleaned and reassembled, held together by wire for study. Nearby, plaster casts preserve the outline of her body, fixed in the pose required by the anatomist who claimed her after her death. Other pieces are suspended in clear fluid, floating in the glass jars, fragments held in place by science. The matter stored on these shelves, the bone, the tissue, the impression of her skin, offers no sign of a life lived. There is no trace of her voice, no memory of her home language, only matter, carefully stabilized and definitively recorded. Almost everything recorded about Saartjie Baartman comes through the perspective of those who measured her, described her, and sought to categorize her. Her own hand left no trace, no private letter, no diary entry, no record of a thought unburdened by public scrutiny. That absence is a significant part of the story. The archive only remembers what served the power that made it. In South Africa, her story is deeply woven into the history of the nation itself. A young Khoisan woman, born into a landscape already affected by colonial expansion, shipped across the sea to Europe. A body made strange for foreign attention. A spectacle whose value was calculated in ticket sales and sheer curiosity. She was measured and discussed. Legal papers were filed over her status. Pamphlets argued her moral standing, and scientists debated her anatomy. Everyone spoke about her. Few truly listened. She lived in public view, but without privacy. She crossed continents, yet was never free. She was known everywhere, but understood by few. She died in Paris in 1815, at the age of 25. For most, the historical account closes there, but her journey did not end. After death, it began a new path. Her body was dissected, preserved, placed on display, stored, and claimed legally by the French state. For nearly 2 centuries, she remained not buried, not returned, and not forgotten, but held by institutional decree. This episode is not about the spectacle, or the scandal, or the voyeurism that surrounded her life. It is about what came after. About how a woman who endured so much in life remained captive in death. And about what it took, legally, politically, morally, to finally bring her home. This is not just a story about a woman who never came home in life. It's a story about what it took to bring her home in death. This is more than a story. Saartjie Baartman was born around 1789, near the mouth of the Gamtoos River in the bitterly contested eastern frontier of the Cape Colony. She was descended from the Eastern Cape Khoisan, the long intermingled society of herding, pastoralist Khoikhoi and the nomadic hunter-gatherer San. By the time she was a child, dispossession was not a future threat. it was daily reality. Rachel Holmes crisply captures this transition in her book, African Queen, stating, quote, "When the Europeans arrived, they had Bibles and the Khoisan had land. By the time of Saartjie's birth, the Khoisan had the Bibles and the Europeans had most of the land." Khoisan grazing lands had been loaned to Dutch farmers. Cattle were seized, families were broken apart. Many Khoisan were forced into wage labor, domestic service, or informal dependency on colonial farms. Others resisted, sometimes violently, trying to reclaim stock and land. Saartjie grew up multilingual. She spoke Afrikaans, likely some Khoisan and Xhosa. She never learned to read or write, but she learned music. She played the ramki, a small stringed instrument, and a single-stringed violin used in Khoisan dance traditions. Her life was not isolated or static. It was shaped by movement, of cattle, of labor, of people pushed and pulled by colonial expansion. At some point in her late teens or early 20s, she was taken to Cape Town. From there, in 1810, she was transported to Europe. The contracts said she agreed. The conditions said otherwise. What matters for this story is not the spectacle of her exhibitions, well documented elsewhere, but the way her body became a site of obsession, measured, commented on, debated, claimed. But for those who may not be familiar with her story, here's a brief picture of what her life in Europe looked like. Her arrival in Europe in 1810 was a brutal passage into a world that saw her only through the lens of her difference. The long journey ended not in a home, but in drafty London rooms and smoky taverns where she was made to mount a small wooden platform. Before her, a relentless line of faces filed past. These crowds came for countless reasons: curiosity, desire, or simply the cheap thrill of mockery. A few even fooled themselves into thinking they were engaged in science. Yet what they truly shared was the rabid conviction that her body was theirs to tear apart with their eyes. Each appearance was a desperate performance of control. She mastered the cues for when to turn, when to hold a fixed pose, when to stand unnervingly still. This control was tenuous, initially cloaked by signed papers, documents she couldn't read, and the paltry sums of money she earned. But the power was never hers. It belonged to the handlers who managed her life and the fickle whim of public interest. When the rooms were packed, she had a fragile measure of protection from the Gawker's cruelty. As the audiences dwindled, that shield vanished entirely. The instability of her position snapped into brutal focus early on. British abolitionists, incensed by the public exhibitions, dragged her case into a courtroom, arguing that her display was a form of slavery. Baartman was brought before the judge. Surrounded by the very men who profited from her, she was asked in a language that wasn't her own if she appeared on her own free will. Her simple answer was taken at face value, her desperate circumstances left unexamined against her single word. The law, satisfied, simply closed its file, and the monstrous spectacle continued. After the court's dismissal, she was forced into a grinding circuit, from Manchester to Bristol, from Bristol to Bath. The novelty quickly wore thin in each new city, and the handballs grew louder, more grotesque, as the audiences began to thin out. There were days when she found herself exhibited alongside caged animals or other performers in the freak show, cementing the horrifying notion that she existed outside the categories of human being. All the while, her image was ravenously consumed. Artists churned out crude sketches, twisting her features with every pencil stroke. Writers filled pamphlets with invented histories and described her body in obscene detail for circulation. The crossing to Paris in 1814 offered no relief, only a shift in the nature of her imprisonment. Saartjie was no longer a public marvel. She had become a subject for a colder, more precise scrutiny. She felt the chill of the city's salons, where naturalists and physicians encircled her, their calipers and measuring tapes replacing the eager hands of the crowds. Their gaze was sharper, their language clinical, and in its scientific detachment, far more dangerous. Her body, long a source of spectacle, began its final betrayal. An early bout of influenza settled deep in her chest, a weight she never truly shook. The unforgiving Paris winters stripped away her reserves, and as her handlers' promised payments faded, her lodgings grew harsher. The damp, cold rooms fostered repeated sickness, deepening the isolation that now defined her days. Solace arrived in a small, brown bottle of brandy, clutched not in self-indulgence, but as the last possible warmth in a world that had become cold and small. By the end of 1815, at the age of 25, she was exhausted. Poverty, chronic illness, and neglect had completed their work. She died in December. The news was met with speculative whispers in the press: smallpox, venereal disease, easy rumors for a sensational life. But Georges Cuvier, the man who would soon dissect her, logged the true cause with scientific clarity: an inflammation, likely pneumonia, worsened by long-term sickness and the comfort sought in alcohol. She did not die as a victim of scandal. She died from being forgotten in plain sight. She succumbed to the damp of neglected rooms, the constant exposure of a life lived for others' observation, and the failure of simple human care. Far from home, she simply faded in quiet exhaustion. And in that final silence, the exploitation of her body merely changed form. The woman who had been paraded for her living flesh was immediately valued for her dead one, transformed in that instant from spectacle to specimen. Her European journey concluded exactly as it had begun, not with her story being told, but with her body being taken. The Parisian winter's chill still clung to Saartjie Baartman when they came for her. Less than 24 hours after her last breath, the journey began, not towards consecrated ground or a family plot, but across the city to the laboratories of the French Museum of Natural History. In the rigid structure of 19th century Parisian life, such a move was extraordinary. The handling of the dead was a matter of strict official record, permitted only for executed criminals or the anonymous poor who died in public wards with no one to claim them. Even then, a scientist required a signed authorization. Bodies were not simply taken on a whim. The city's tightly woven regulations were a well-known barrier, a system designed to protect citizens from being reduced to a teaching tool. But Saartjie Baartman fit none of these legal categories. She was not a felon. She had not died a pauper, an unknown face in a crowded hospital bed. Her name was recorded, her face familiar from the newspapers and the private salons where she had been displayed. She was a known individual whose life had been followed, debated, and consumed by the very society now moving her remains. Her foreign status, the absence of a family to argue her right to burial, provided the required silence. She was officially designated unclaimed. That simple classification pulled her into a legal shadow, a grey zone understood and routinely exploited by powerful institutions. The letter of the law did not need to be broken. It merely required a slight shift in focus, a collective decision that the pursuit of scientific knowledge, held more weight than the dignity of the dead. The statutes remained fixed, but the practice of power was flexible. It moved not through written decrees, but through discretion, deciding who deserved the full protection of the law and who could be quietly moved outside its concern. The moment she was loaded onto the cart, the debate was over. By the time her body was received in the lab, the question was no longer if dissection should happen. The only subject of interest was what new fact could be stripped from her body. And once that question became the accepted premise, the rest unfolded with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. At the center of the dissection process was a man named Georges Cuvier. Cuvier was not any anatomist. He was a senior figure in French science, a trusted advisor to the state, and a man whose requests carried weight. When he asked for access to Baartman's body, the system did not resist. The dissection was not a hurried act. It unfolded over days, following a precise sequence. Cuvier and his assistants worked methodically. First, plaster casts were taken directly from Baartman's body, full-length casts meant to preserve her physical form exactly as it was. The molds were refined by artists, polished, painted, and sealed with varnish. Even before the dissection was complete, her body had already been transformed into an object meant to last. Only then did the post-mortem begin. Her organs were removed and set aside for preservation. Large glass jars were prepared, filled with alcohol for long-term storage. Her brain was taken last, preserved in liquid, and catalogued for future study. Cuvier's primary interest, however, lay elsewhere. Particular attention was given to her genitalia and buttocks, modelled in wax, then stored alongside the originals in glass. In this way, her body was duplicated, once in preserved tissue, once in cast and model. Finally, her skeleton was disarticulated. The bones were boiled to remove flesh, cleaned, dried, labelled, and prepared for reassembly. By the time the lab was cleaned and the work concluded, Saartjie Baartman no longer existed as a whole. She existed as parts, a skeleton for comparison, organs in jars, a cast for display. Nothing was returned to the earth. She had arrived alive in Paris, and in death, she was already where science wanted her to be. By the early 19th century, European science, increasingly confident in its ability to explain the world, began to rank human difference. Bodies were measured, compared, and arranged along imagined scales of development. Some were placed at the top, others pushed closer to nature, to instinct. Baartman's body entered Europe at exactly this moment. To the men who studied her, she did not appear as an individual shaped by history or circumstance. She appeared as evidence, a body used to support ideas already taking form about who belonged at the center of civilization and who existed at its edges. This way of thinking hardened, observation turned into certainty, difference became destiny. Inequality was no longer questioned, it was explained. Later, these beliefs would be given a name: social Darwinism. Its logic, already at work, told a reassuring story to those in power, that hierarchy was natural, progress inevitable, and domination simply the way the world arranged itself. Within that frame, holding Baartman's body did not feel like cruelty, it felt like science doing its job. Even in death, Saartjie Baartman's body continued to work, not for herself, but for a system that needed her to mean something very specific. There's something else worth noticing about Georges Cuvier. For a man who shaped how Europe understood human difference, he travelled very little. He did not join expeditions into Africa. He did not dig burial grounds or strip bones himself. He worked at a distance, from Paris. Cuvier issued instructions instead. He wrote to explorers and collectors, explaining how skeletons should be prepared in the field. Bones were to be boiled to remove flesh, labelled carefully, and shipped back to Europe. Sentiment, he warned, had no place in scientific work. Reason alone should guide the expedition. This was how knowledge moved, outward in theory, inward in material. And then, in an extraordinary turn, Saartjie Baartman arrives in Paris alive. No battlefield, no grave, no journey required. She came to the centre of European science on her own 2 feet, already observed, already discussed. When she died, her body was not something Cuvier had to seek out. It was delivered to him, legally ambiguous, socially exposed, and immediately available. For Cuvier, this was a rare opportunity. The specimen he might otherwise only imagine was suddenly close at hand. There was no resistance to overcome, no distance to cross. Everything he had written about collecting bodies elsewhere could now be done at home. And that, perhaps, is the quietest cruelty in this story. The violence of colonial science does not always happen at the edges of empire. Sometimes it waits patiently at the center, ready when the body arrives. By the 1850s, a chilling new silence fell over Saartjie Baartman. It wasn't the peace of a grave, it was the quiet of a scientific exhibit. Her remains, the bones and the plaster cast, were installed as permanent fixtures in the galleries of the Museum of Natural History. For over 100 years, she was trapped there, an object serving someone else's story. Visitors were deliberately steered. A polished skeleton stood mounted upright, its joints stiffly wide into a lifelike stance. Right next to it was the full-body plaster cast, painted to look like living skin, a perfect mirror. The point was to take them in together, the bone structure beneath the flesh, an anatomy lesson in human difference. This difference was cemented by the text below. Gleaming brass plaques offered zero context on the life she lived. No mention of the coercion, the illness, or the utter poverty of her final years. Instead, they used the cold language of measurement and category. Her body was stripped of its unique humanity, becoming a set of features meant to stand in for an entire race. She was an argument disguised as a fact. Decades became generations. The words on the placards changed marginally over time, but the core, reductive logic held fast. Outside, the world shifted after the Second World War. The long, unquestioned authority of racial science started to crumble. Museums began the slow, painful process of self-reflection, questioning the morality built into their own walls. Still, change didn't arrive until 1974. The skeleton and cast weren't removed with ceremony or a public apology. There was no announcement admitting the decades of harm. They were simply packaged away because the modern scientific narrative had moved on, leaving the old, discredited theories behind. The glass case was quietly dismantled. The explanatory labels, the very foundation of the long-held argument, were filed away and forgotten. The gallery space was repurposed, its history effectively wiped clean. And so, she vanished once more, not into any form of rest or dignity, but into the sterile, institutional silence of storage. The long silence around Saartjie Baartman was finally broken, not with a roar, but a tremor. Throughout the 1970s in South Africa, a new wave of historians and writers began to pick through the brittle pages of colonial archives. What they uncovered was not merely a curiosity, but a life systematically erased, a name buried beneath layers of academic exploitation. She re-entered public consciousness as a powerful lens through which to examine how black women's bodies had been forced to bear the weight of European racial fantasies, sparking sharp, necessary debates about race, memory, and the true shape of feminism. Yet, for a long time, the discussions remained abstract. Where was the person behind the symbol? The answer was a vague, almost comforting assumption. France, locked away in some dusty museum vault, safely beyond the reach of ethical consequence or repatriation. For decades, this hazy certainty went unchallenged. Then the cracks started to show. As the 1980s tipped into the 1990s, a small, relentless collective of scholars and activists shifted their focus, moving past the rhetoric of symbolism towards a concrete, physical objective. Central to this effort was the South African paleoanthropologist Philip Tobias, a man whose career had been a sustained campaign against racial pseudoscience. He understood the institutional terrain, the museums, the scientific societies, the legal labyrinth. He was among the first to articulate the demand openly: Baartman's remains must be returned home. Tobias grasped the audacity of the request. No major European institution had ever willingly relinquished such a trophy, but the political ground was shifting beneath their feet. In 1994, South Africa emerged from the deep isolation of apartheid, establishing a new democratic government committed, however imperfectly, to confronting its violent history. Suddenly, the question of restitution was no longer a philosophical exercise. It became a non-negotiable step in the project of nation building. Land, historical archives, and, most critically, human remains were placed at the heart of this new reality. Baartman's case stood apart from all the rest. Unlike so many lost histories, hers was tragically complete. Her journey out of southern Africa was documented, her brutal treatment in Europe was recorded, and most powerfully of all, her remains were not missing, they were perfectly preserved. In 1995, South Africa's formal request reached France. It was a careful document, respectful and entirely non-accusatory, making a deliberate point of not blaming the modern French state for the dark acts of the 19th century. The South African delegation insisted this was a unique case, a singular injustice that demanded a singular remedy. Yet, the answer that returned was not acceptance, but a slow, legalistic refusal. At the core of the standoff lay a single, formidable French word: inalienability. This was a concept forged in the revolutionary spirit, an ancient bulwark meant to protect the nation's treasures. Since those first violent upheavals, the state had ring-fenced certain public properties as untouchable, treating them as part of the republic itself. Museum collections, vast and silent, fell within this iron circle. An object might enter a museum, but it could never leave. It belonged to all of France, and what belonged to the republic could not be sold, traded, or simply given away. The idea was designed as a fortress against greed and chaos. It's why priceless paintings endured through wars, why ancient fossils remained in public view instead of vanishing into private vaults, and why collections passed intact from one generation to the next. In theory, this was a vital safeguard, a stable anchor against the shifting tides of corruption or political whim. In practice, however, it was absolute. The law made no subtle distinction. A painting, a sculpture, or human remains, once classified and archived within a public collection, was simply an item in a category. The nature of the thing held mattered less than the bureaucratic label it wore. Saartjie Baartman's conserved remains, catalogued and stored, were fully inside that legal, unbreakable category. This was the reason for the museum's official quiet, repeated insistence. It is not possible. It wasn't a denial of the historical wrong, but a statement of their own powerlessness. The law offered no mechanism for release, no path for restitution, and no panel for ethical review. The only way to move the remains was to shatter the rule of inalienability itself. And that power lay in one place: Parliament. Returning the woman known as the Hottentot Venus was never going to be a simple decision for a curator or a government minister. It required elected lawmakers to step in and explicitly declare that the fundamental rule protecting everything must, in this instance, not apply. That necessity is why the process dragged on for so long. Inalienability was a design for resistance. It was built to slow things down, to resist political tides, and to make radical change difficult by default. Its core assumption was that keeping heritage was inherently safer, more responsible, than letting it go. For nearly 2 decades, that assumption held firm, absolute and unquestioned. Then, a single body, taken under coercion and kept as a curiosity, forced the law to confront the one question it was never structured to ask. What happens when the very thing you are sworn to protect should never have been taken and held in the first place? The resistance was also rooted in a deeper anxiety. Museum directors, whose institutions were stuffed with the spoils of empire, were terrified of the precedent Saartjie Baartman's release would set. They imagined a floodgate opening, skulls snatched from bloody battlefields, bodies dragged out of colonial graves, precious artifacts hauled away on expeditions, all suddenly subject to repatriation claims. Behind those polished doors, the fear was palpable. One director, Henry de Lumley, was the public face of the opposition. He initially fought the request outright, suggesting Baartman's remains had found a kind of security in France, cherished, he argued, within the very walls that championed liberty and equality. The comment, heavy with colonial arrogance, landed like a stone in a silent pool. In South Africa, frustration quickly curdled into anger. Officials saw the blatant contradiction. Europe's museums guarded their heritage with fierce possessiveness, treating objects of immense emotional value as untouchable. Yet, when Africans stepped up to claim their own heritage, their demands were dismissed as sentimental distractions or disruptive politics. The gulf in understanding became an intractable stalemate. By the late 1990s, official negotiations had simply gone quiet. The request hadn't been rejected, but it had stalled, caught in the slow, bureaucratic gears of international diplomacy. Legal ingenuity failed to shift the debate, but then the global context began to change. In the year 2000, across the Mediterranean, Spain agreed to return the remains of a Southern African man known as El Negro. His body had been on public display for decades in a Spanish museum. After years of protest, his remains were finally sent home to Botswana. The repatriation was loud, and it drew a harsh spotlight from the world. Suddenly, the French fear of setting a precedent collapsed. Saartjie Baartman's case no longer felt unique or impossible. Instead, it looked delayed, waiting for its inevitable conclusion. The calls from South Africa did not just come in the form of formal letters anymore. Ministers were speaking directly to one another. The issue of Saartjie Baartman climbed the diplomatic ladder, a heavy, unavoidable question laid out on polished tables at the highest levels of government. Yet an unexpected current began to move inside France itself. Beyond the official channels, more and more French politicians took up the cause. Their argument was simple. Returning the remains of a woman held captive as an object for 2 centuries wouldn't be a sign of national weakness. Instead, it would prove a necessary courage, showing a willingness to truly face a documented, difficult past. This complicated legal terrain was suddenly breached by the simplest thing, an intervention no one could have predicted. In 1998, Diana Ferris, a South African poet and storyteller of Khoisan descent, wrote a poem. It didn't offer a history lesson or an academic critique. It was simply one woman speaking directly to Saartjie Baartman across the immense silence of time. Ferris didn't dwell on the spectacle that made Baartman notorious, or the crude science that sought to dissect her. She spoke only of a grave absence, a lack, and the essential need for return. The poem painted the picture of a woman's body pulled far from the earth that knew her, enduring the long, silent ache of separation. It reframed Baartman, not as a symbol to be debated, but as a person who had waited patiently for the sound of her name being called for the journey home. The poem's power in the French Senate lay precisely in this simplicity. It sidestepped all the legal jargon and the weight of museum precedent. It made no argument. It simply offered an invitation. The debate instantly shifted. The question was no longer about policy or diplomatic protocol. It was about whether a nation was capable of listening when the plain truth was finally spoken. It is time now. Senators began to read the poem aloud. It was quoted, passed from hand to hand in a setting designed for procedure and restraint. In that place dedicated to impersonal law, the simple words did the impossible. They made Saartjie Baartman present. The discussion changed in both tone and focus. It wasn't a negotiation between museums or ministers anymore, but a challenge to the law itself. Could the legal structure recognize a human being trapped inside a system built only for objects? The debate moved out of official correspondence and into the process of creating new legislation. With this shift, the stakes became immediate and sharp. If the law could not bend in this single, clear, fully documented case, one that had become so heavily symbolic, it would quietly declare the precise limits of justice in the modern state. Saartjie Baartman had already waited nearly 200 years for recognition. The question was no longer whether she deserved to come home, but whether the modern French state was willing to make room for her at all. The final breakthrough came when the issue landed on Nelson Mandela's desk. He approached it with a quiet, unrelenting force, deliberately refusing to frame it as a culture war. He understood that complex systems rarely yield to simple persuasion. They require the weight of undeniable moral authority to be forced into motion. When Mandela spoke Saartjie Baartman's name directly to the French leadership, the dynamic in the room fundamentally changed. The request stopped being a forgotten piece of paper in diplomatic channels. It became a personal question from a man whose life embodied the long, painful fight against institutional injustice, a man who understood exactly how procedure could become a shield for cruelty. In January 2002, the shift in the Senate chamber was palpable. Senators, compelled to face the facts of the case, spoke openly about the vast gulf between France's stated ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, and the grotesque reality of holding onto a woman's remains against her homeland's will. On January 29, 2002, the Senate approved the bill. The National Assembly followed suit weeks later, the vote unanimous. There was no grand statement or sweeping apologies for the past. The new law didn't try to erase history. It simply authorized the transfer of Saartjie Baartman's remains back to South Africa. After 187 years, the argument was finally over. The final action felt almost anticlimactic. Her remains were prepared for the long journey home. Her skeleton, cleaned of flesh ages ago, was settled into a foam-lined container. Next to it, glass jars holding organs, preserved in fluid, were crated up. A full-body plaster cast, a stark, static echo of the life they had taken, went along too. Everything that had been stolen was now starting its slow voyage back. On April the 29th, 2002, the transfer became official. In the hushed formality of the South African embassy in Paris, the French government handed custody of her remains to her homeland's representatives. The necessary diplomatic language was exchanged, words meant to mark a formal end to a centuries-old offence. Yet the real moment happened quietly, away from the lenses. Her custody had simply shifted hands. In early May, she was carefully placed aboard South African Airways Flight 275. The plane lifted off from Paris, heading into the night towards Johannesburg. Just before the long flight landed, the captain's voice cut through the cabin quiet. He announced a special passenger was on board. This time, Saartjie Baartman was not travelling in secret. The news of her return spread globally. From Johannesburg, she was flown south to Cape Town. The landing gear touched down. Her casket, draped in the new South African flag, was slowly lowered onto the tarmac. A small band played a heavy, somber tune. Inside the terminal, children were pressed against the windows, their breath fogging the glass as they watched this historic arrival. Her homecoming was a moment of profound recognition, a reckoning long overdue for countless Khoisan descendants. Still, it was also a complex beginning. The return immediately sparked a debate. Who now had the right to speak for her? Who would decide the customs for her burial? Was anyone truly left who could legitimately claim her as family? Arguments flared up. Some felt shut out of the process. Others worried the event would become too political. But the disagreements themselves signaled a powerful change. She had become visible again. After weeks of public discussion, a site was chosen. She would rest near Hankie, close to the Gamtoos River where she was born. On August the 9th, 2002, a day already reserved for South Africa's women and its indigenous peoples, Saartjie Baartman was finally laid to rest. The ceremony mixed the old with the new. Khoisan cleansing rituals were performed over the dry earth. Earth was returned to earth. Songs rose into the hot air. Speeches acknowledged the long injustice. Thousands attended, the mood serious, not celebratory. No one pretended the ceremony could undo what had been done. The moment offered something more modest, and perhaps more honest, an end to a journey that had dragged on for far too long. Yet as she was buried, it was clear her story hadn't resolved neatly. Her return took extraordinary effort, personal interventions, international pressure, a special law. Most human remains held in museums would never receive such attention. Her case hadn't fixed the system that held her, it had simply found a way around it. And that might be the most unsettling truth. Her story exposed not just the cruelty of the past, but the quiet tenacity of the structures built within it. These structures persisted long after the beliefs that created them had been discredited. Saartjie Baartman is home now, but the questions her body carries across 2 centuries, questions about human ownership, dignity, and the very limits of justice, remain utterly alive. Her final work is not to grant closure. It is to remind a new generation how much effort it takes, even today, to simply let the dead rest. After everything she endured, there was a temptation to stop speaking, to mistake silence for respect. But the silence had been her first captor. It was silence that let others define who she was, what she meant, and where she belonged. Remembering her now means refusing to let absence have the last word.